Today we're going to talk about the Gypsies. The Gypsies, how they came to Yetholm, where they came from, and why they came to Yetholm. We think maybe the Gypsies came from the Far East, the very Far East, Hindustan, India. And we think on their travels they came through the Middle East. By history books that we read, we think they came into Egypt, and from Egypt they cut away up into the European countries, Yugoslavia, Romania, Germany, and along the North African coast and across into Spain. They spread around Spain, up into France, and they cut away further west and they've sailed up into Ireland. And we think they came east and into the west coast of Scotland, along the central belt of Scotland, down into the west coast of Scotland and down to the east coast. They came down into the borders. The Gypsies were heard about, well, in Turkey in the 15th century. In 1420 they went into Germany, and from there they were banished in 1500, into Spain in 1430 and banished again. Into France in the early 1500s, again they were banished, but they always seemed to be leaving some of them in that countries. Henry VIII tried to ban them from England as well. But in Scotland, which we are really interested in, is in 1506, James IV gave the power to the Gypsies to rule themselves, and they would live by their own rules. If somebody misbehaved or murdered, they were hanged by themselves. A tribe within our country, which carried on that way. And then, of course, what happens? They misbehaved. They couldn't behave themselves, and then in 1541 they were banned from Scotland. And we know that from the books that we read, if you were a gypsy, you were hanged just because you were a gypsy, and the ladies were drowned. And then they started to think, how could we survive? How could we save ourselves? And we think that they started taking the local names. And this meant all the local names were used up, the Douglases, the Blythes, the Rutherfords, the Ruthvens. In the west coast of Scotland, it was the Marshalls in the west. And they were very much like, had their own territories, and they had to look after their own territories. And if one encroached on, there would be battles, and there were many battles in the central part of Scotland, in the central borders. They had the Marshalls and the Blythes and the Farrs, the Ruthvens. They all had battles. They always looked after their own territory, just like animals when you think about it. They're very much the same. But anyway, they started using the local names, and on what they would do to try and save themselves, because if the sheriff's men came round and looked at them, they would say, oh, you're gypsies. But then they would say, if a young lady maybe fell by the wayside and had a child out of marriage, the gypsy would take the child from her. They would help her by doing so, but it would also help themselves. And they would say to the sheriff's men, but there's our children, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, that's our children. Oh yes, so they are, but that's sometimes how they saved themselves. Saved the young lady from embarrassment maybe, and they also saved themselves. But the Gypsies always went with their floats. I mean, they were just about unmistakable. You couldn't just about say they were not Gypsies. They had their floats, and they had their ponies and their dogs, and they had their lurchers. I say the dogs, the lurchers, they're the ones that were the breadwinners. They're the ones that fed them, really, because they lived off the land. And of course, some of them were very industrious. They made baskets and they sell all those different things, all the little things they did do. And some of them were quite good. They used to come round sharpening knives and that sort of thing. But then there were tinklers as well, and they would repair all your pans or anything like that, and they would make things. Obviously, not being there, we couldn't actually vouch for that. Again, to me, the Gypsies were always distinct in their own ways. They couldn't get away from it. They were travellers, and that's what they always wanted to do. A few of them did stay around. James V, after the flooding, he let them stay there. And I mean, their names told you right away. Antonio Borra, Sebastian Lalo, Sinaston Fango and Johnny Farr. I mean, if they came along and got your names, you would no doubt at where they came from. They certainly weren't the Borderers, or they weren't the Scots. The books that we read in 1609, those gypsies were hanged in Edinburgh for just being gypsies, and that was it. But again, as I've said, they started to dress like locals, took the local names, intermarry. But I don't think there'd be very much intermarry in a way about the 1600s, 1700s, because they were very much a tribe, and they stuck to their own tribe. If somebody was outside the tribe, I wouldn't say that they were accepted very much. And the area of the Borders in Yetholm, they came down here. It was easy access to be across the border. If the Scots were hammering them or looking for them, they could nip across the border. We're only a mile and a half from the border, and it was there that they could nip across. And then, of course, if they were caught on the other side in Northumbrian, they would just come back over here. And then we had one or two who lived around the village. And it was the local laird, when he was called up to fight for the country, sent across the European wars at the Battle of Namur in 1695, which is actually in Belgium, where Captain Bennett was injured. And there was a young gypsy there with him who saved him. He carried him back to the back of the battle, and he saved his life. And he promised him that when they got back to Yetholm, if they all got back, that he would give them houses in the village. And this is the place that's known today as the High Street, or Muggers Row, and it's the one that follows up the hill towards Holterburn. And he built houses there for them, and they were to stay there. Obviously they didn't stay during the summer because they would be off, but that was where they were. They came back in the winter, and there was a nominal fee for these things. Not very much, I suppose. It was just a lot so that they could live there when they were with their children. But it's a young lad, that saved the laird's life. It wasn't an officer; he was the laird. So that was them saved, and at least they got a place they could say that there was their homestead, really. And of course, the high cheekbones, you could always tell the gypsies, the dark curly hair, dark skin. And the Youngs, the Douglases, the Blythes. The Blythes, as we know, they're the most famous name in the whole lot of the gypsies, whereas we had Che Blythe, as we know him locally, the one who sailed round the world, and then there's Bill Clinton, who was born a Blythe. Bill Clinton in America, who is the president. He was born William Jefferson Blythe IV, and he became president of America. And he actually recognised the fact that he was a Blythe. His father died, and his mother remarried a Clinton, and he took the name of Clinton, and I think that was 1962, changed his name to Clinton. It wouldn't have been great if he had a Blythe. Well, he was a Blythe. He had been a president of America who came from Yetholm. They reckoned that they left here in about 1786. We've no real record of that, but this is the things that we try and pick up on. And they went to America. Brave people to go from the border hills away to America in an old sailing ship, but they did it. And there were some gypsies that were quite high in the local. There was some of them was a member of Parliament, and there was a Captain Farr who was a member of Parliament, master of the local Masonic lodges. There were Blythes in that, and there was the Farrs in that. So there were some that were quite smart. But back to the locals, into the locals, you had, as I said, Douglases, and there seemed to be a lot of Douglases. And of course the Douglases have got a famous name in Scotland, the Black Douglas. And they were famous for all the battles. You maybe heard about the Black Douglases. And they always say when there were so many Matthew Douglases, it was strange when you heard some of the stories about them, talking about Matthew Douglas. There were 7 Matthew Douglases in Yetholm. And when somebody came to looking for Matthew Douglas, they would have to ask him, what Matthew Douglas are you looking for? Are you looking for Fat Matthew, Slim Matthew, Matthew with a stick, Matthew with a limp? All the different names. That was the only way to tell the difference. And all of them, they all had their own, what we call nicknames. And everyone in the village had a nickname. And it's only lately in the last sort of 30 years, 40 years, that they didn't have nicknames. Because everybody was known by their nicknames rather than by their proper names. Even myself, who had a nickname which we shall not divulge. There was Tanner and Stovie, Jock and Stifle and Croxy. Where they got these names, I shall never know. Living in the borders here, it was a different way of life. If you think that they came from the Far East, surely they would have some of the old customs that they used over there. They worked their wealth in donkeys. If you had a lot of donkeys, you were a wealthy man. If you were a horner, you made spoons. Have you heard of the horn spoons? They were very good at doing things like that. And there was potter, and then they made brushes, and they made clothes pegs, gold rings. They made the bosoms, or the brooms as we would call them. And of course they were horse dealers. Because I remember just as a boy going with this gypsy chap who was a young, and he was very good at selling. But you ask him to write something and there's no way he could manage it, but he could sell and count money. And I would say that was maybe the gypsy trait. They could sell and they could talk. They certainly could con people. And then we had the fortune tellers. They were the ones that made a little bit of money. I don't know if they made a lot of money, but they would make money. They seemed they could read characters. That was the thing about them. Some people have got this gift. Gypsies seem to have it. And that's how they would live. And trust, well, if a gypsy was your friend, you could rest assured he was your friend. But mind, if he was an enemy, you may look out, because he could be a horrible enemy. But living around the village, and the stories that were passed down to my grandfathers and my great-grandfather, and even to my mother, who was a real local, not a gypsy, in case she was waiting for me when I go up there. She was never a gypsy, but she was always quite fond of the gypsy people. My grandfather was a great lover of the gypsies, and he did a lot with them. So you're talking away about the 1800s, and he did help them whenever he could. Again, as I say, if they were your friend and you could trust them to the end of the earth, more or less. And they had a great sense of wit. They seemed to have that. I don't know why, because sometimes their life must have been quite poor. But they lived and they had the sense of wit. A little story that I often tell. The minister was coming along the street and there's a lot of gypsies standing at the corner. And they were all standing there, and when the minister came forward, "Well, men, what are you speaking about tonight?" "Well, minister," said one, "I was saying we were discussing 2 words here." "Oh yes, and can I help you?" "Well, we were hoping you would." "And what are the words?" "Well, minister, let's remember and recollect. If you could maybe clarify them for us." "Well, you see, to remember is something that's in the past that you've just sort of forgotten about. Remember, trying to think back. And why do you want to know anyway?" "Well," one of the gypsies spoke up, he says, "Minister, I remember making a basket for you, but I can't recollect ever getting paid for it." Again, it was always the women that did this persuading or selling, because they were the ones that always went to the doors. They would try and think. You never saw a man coming to the door very often selling stuff. It was always the women. The men would be standing back there, just keeping an eye on everything. And that would be the way that was. That's the way it was. Again, the local blacksmith who lived not very far from here, where I'm sitting, he had his blacksmith shop. And he was very fond of the gypsies. And one day, the gypsy lad, it was Stovie Jock, brought in his donkey. And the blacksmith says, "Now look, Jock, I can't shoe your pound of the day. I've no time." And then he wanted to shoe my pound of the day. "I heard yours died yesterday, and I've brought a yenny mine across. You can have a Leonard until you get another yen." So there was the kindness that came through in them. And it was nice to think of them sometimes in this way. They weren't all bad. It just so happened that the bad ones always seemed to come forward and they would be talking about it. Well, in the summertime, or in early spring, the houses that the gypsies lived in Kirkyaton were closed up. And off they went, travelling round the borders. And in the spring, in the Yarrow valleys and the Ettrick valleys, they used to think, "My goodness, here's the spring." The rivers would be cleaned out with trout. The hen houses would lose an egg or two, and maybe even a hen or two. And of course, sometimes the sheep disappeared from the side of the hill because they had to live. But it was just proving it. And this is what happened. They closed the houses up. And lots of people didn't like them, I know that. But some of them got on, not, as I say, not too bad with them. And we're getting up to the 1700s now. And about 1670, Jean Gordon was born. Jean was a real gypsy. And she came from here. And she travelled the borders. Now, Jean, I don't know how she managed it. She was a very tall woman. She wore a big cloak and she had a big staff. She was over 6 feet tall. She was not one that you would meddle with. Not at all. 12 children. So how she'd brought up 12 children and travelled the countryside, one never knows, but she did. Jean was very friendly with Sir Walter Scott's father, and she would call in at Abbotsford when she was travelling that way. And Walter Scott wrote in some of his memories, in his books, he would say, you know, I cried piteously sometimes when I heard Jean Gordon talking to my father and telling him about how badly treated they were. And of course, as we know, Jean Gordon was included in his book in Guy Mannering. She was Meg Merrilies. And that's just how that she came to be there. Again, when Jean Gordon heard that some of her sons had been taken to the jail, and she was at the Bridge End Park in Kelso, where Sir William Douglas lived, and she was coming away from there, and she met two of the people who worked for Sir William Douglas, and they just to tease her, I think, said, oh, your sons, we hear they're going to be hanged at the next district court at Jedburgh. Anyway, she was quite upset about this, and she followed them back, and I think they blamed her for setting fire to the house there, and she was taken to court, and she was pinned by her ear to one of the posts in the centre of Jedburgh for 15 minutes, and then she was taken out and taken down further down the hill and pinned for another thing through her earlobes for another 15 minutes. And then they took her to court, and she pleaded with them to let her go. She said, oh, please don't put me in. I'm not used to being locked up. But she was a wild character, let's be fair about it. And anyway, they let her go, and she promised she would never come back to Scotland. And she travelled over the border in England. She had 12 of her family, 3 daughters and 9 boys. One of her boys was killed, murdered, but she actually found out who the man was, and she followed him all around the country until she got him arrested. He actually went to Ireland to get away from her, but she got him, and she got him brought back to this country, and he was hanged in Jedburgh. And then the other 8 sons, they were all hanged in Jedburgh for sheep stealing. But anyway, Jean carried on her travels through the borders on the English side, and she finished up at Carlisle. And it was there that she maybe has been misbehaving again. I think it was their character that couldn't help it, and the crowd there that day took her and threw her into Eden, just at Carlisle, and she wasn't drowned, because I think they said she got to the other side, but she had been so ill. She was an old lady then when this happened, and she crawled out, but the next morning her body was found on the side of the Eden. And there's a wee piece of poetry there that goes, Old Meg, she was a gypsy, and she lived upon the moor. Her bed the brown heath tuff, and her house was out of doors. The last verse goes something like, Old Jean, she wore a big red cloak, and she was tall as an Amazon. I hope that somebody has buried her bones, because she has long since gone. So that was Jean Gordon, and she left, quite as I say, quite a few of the family, and they carried on around the borders. After she died, 1746, we got Will Father First. Now, he was another man who had a big family. He had been married 3 times, and he had 24 children. So he was quite active in certain parts of his life. And the thing was, it surprises me when you read the books about him, he had 24 children, and everyone was christened, because they weren't Christians. They had their own gypsy tribes, but he had the christening on the green, and he insisted on having the local minister to christen his children. And it seemed they must have been all born in the summer, because they had the thing on the village green in Kirkietum. A goodly king. And he had a job. Somebody asked him if he worked, because, I mean, even although they were kings of the gypsies, they did have to work because that's the only way. There wasn't the money. He says, no, I didn't work. He says, I'm no lazy, but I'm no fond of work. And today we have an awful lot of people like that. They're not fond of working at all. But he admitted that. But he actually did have a little job. It was a restorer of stolen goods. If somebody had lost something, like a horse or some sheep or some cattle or something like that, they would go to him and say, look, I've lost my horse, I've lost this. And he would search the countryside and he would usually bring it back to them. So that was what he called the restorer of stolen goods. Again, and when he died in 1847, we had King Charles I. And that was quite a coronation. And he worked locally, carted coals, and if there was a chance of getting any smuggling done, he would do smuggling, because this is what they did. Carried the whisky across the border, it was easy for them if there was no customs and excise around, and but he worked like that, smuggling salt, and we have down there smuggling the whisky and bringing back gin from Bulmer, because gin of course came from Holland, and that's why. And there's so many ladies in this country are so glad that he was able to bring gin back, and it gives them for their gin and tonic. After he died, we had Wilfar II. He lived to... The thing is, what I can never understand is the gypsies, on their meagre rations, they lived to a ripe old age. There's Wilfar II lived till he was 96. So that's a fair age for him. And he was landlord of the Queen in Yetholm. There are little pieces of poetry that comes out about Will. There's a canny Wilfar o' Kirk Yetholm. He lives at the sign of the Queen. He got a great slash in his hand when coming frae Bulmer wi' gin. He met the customs and excise, and Will had nothing to defend himself with. He only had a stick or a cudgel. He seemed to be quite a clever chap, a good conversationalist. He did a lot of reading, and he knew a lot about the Bible. So even although they weren't Christians in that respect, he knew a lot about the Bible. He was also buried in Kirk Yetholm. And when he died in 1861, he had no sons, but he had two daughters, Helen and Etty. And Etty, as we later knew her as Esther, but her nickname was not a nickname, but her just shortened name was Etty. And she lived at Coldstream. And Helen, Princess Helen, they called her Princess Helen because she was the daughter of the king. And they thought she would be the queen, but Queen Esther, or Etty, she queried that, and she came back up there. And it said in one book I did read that they fought on the green to see who would win, and Queen Esther won. And they lived in the palace at that time was Burnside, which is, the site is still there. The house would be slightly different then, but it was at Burnside, which is on the green in Kirk Yetholm. So when Queen Esther became queen, she couldn't live in the palace because her sister was in it, and she moved up the hill to the very small house, her abode for 30 years. She had a lot of children. She had 12 children. She was a good queen because she visited all the local houses in the borders, all the lords and ladies, and they accepted her. And she gave the gypsies credibility, which maybe sometimes they were lacking. And she went to, which we hear about lately, the late Duke of Buccleuch just died 4 weeks ago. But she used to visit the Duke and Duchess of Buccleuch, the Lord and Lady, the Earl of Montefiore. She went there whenever they were at home, and she was accepted, and they accepted her very well. The Dukes of Roxburgh, they all seemed to accept her. She was a good queen. And the Waterfords down at Ford Castle, she visited there, and she was accepted. We're talking about burials now and the gypsy way of life and what happened when they died. Well, they used to burn everything, their caravans, and then they stopped that and reverted back just to burying their clothes and all their movable goods, and that would be enough just to satisfy everybody. And I'm talking about the times when a local gypsy she was supposed to be a queen from Northumbrian. She came up to the borders to be buried, and it was quite a big do. And I couldn't understand why when they were telling me that the undertaker said, I can't understand what happened, but the coffin was left open just by the side of the grave, and everybody followed round and put money in, notes. It had to be notes. All the notes were put in, and everybody had filed past. The lid was screwed down, and the coffin was dropped into the grave. And this big digger came along with this massive slab of concrete and dropped it on top of the coffin. So there was no fear of anybody getting into the coffin to get the money back. So what a waste of money. That was the day the undertaker thought maybe that'd be a good idea. He put the biggest amount of money in, put it in a cheque, so it was okay. He signed a big cheque. So there's no fear of that being cashed in. Anyway, food. What did they do with the food? They would say if you're taking a chicken, they'd maybe dig a hole in the ground and create a fire and cover the chicken or the hen. It would be a hen, a big hen or something like that, and cover it with soil and put it in and let it bake until it was finished. You know, when they took it out, they took the clay off and everything just came off. The feathers and everything came with it. Then they would take the insides out. They always said if you leave the insides in, it gave it a bit of flavour. But it's not a sort of thing that we would do, I don't think. And always the thing that the gypsies and I remember just at the latter days, we had an old gypsy lived not far from us, and she used to make hare soup, which to me was the most horrendous food in all the world. Hare soup, the smell was enough to put you off for life. But they made it with all the different greens, the blood of the hare and everything went in. It's enough to put you on a diet. In a family, it was always the oldest that was married first. There was no getting away from it. So if somebody fancied the younger daughter or a younger the daughters, he had to wait until the other ones were married. It was just, you maybe sometimes have a long wait. Come to divorce, which even they had divorces, they would say they would kill a horse. And they would walk around the horse, the man one way and the woman the other, and said, I divorced you 3 times. The man would walk away, and he usually had somebody else waiting for him. Well, we heard about Will Farr. He had 3 wives, and the wife had to walk away, and she couldn't be married again. But the man could pick another wife. He was okay. So us men probably were either lucky or unlucky. I don't know. But the women never left the tribe. That was the thing. They went with them, and that was and there are many stories that we could tell, but it takes too long to tell them. But that was what would happen. The poor women couldn't marry again. What a shame. Never mind. That's the thing. That's the way it goes. There's one wee story about the man. Now, some of these gypsies, you know, they were very smart, and a lot of them joined the army, and they made a good life out of the army. And we always think about the one who went down. He was in the Durham Light Infantry, and he must have been a very smart man, because I think back to some of the gypsies that were around when I was a youngster. Very smart. And he married this merchant's daughter in Durham. Courted her, and he told her that he was the son of a local farmer up in the borders. So when they arrived back to Yetholm, into one of these houses in Muggers Row, where there was about 2 rooms, and lucky if there was a decent bedroom, and there was cows in the passageway, and horses had to come through the house to get to the stable, she realised what a mistake she'd made. But that's what happens, I suppose. But what I thought was nice when you read about it, she stuck by her husband. They lived in Kirkheaton for a while, then they moved to Hawick, and then they moved away. I think they tell me they moved away to America. And maybe that was the case. A little piece of poetry that somebody wrote, we live in courtship, but in wedlock wake. And that was a woman that woke up when she realised that she came to Yetholm, and her father-in-law was not a farmer, but he was just a gypsy. But there we are. I think that now I'm going to show you a few slides. Here we have a picture of Kelso Square, 1883, and this is covered by the gypsies. Now there you've got a fair selection of gypsy caravans, some with the covered roofs, some with the square, but then there are some just with a horse and a cart pulling. Now how did these gypsies manage to survive in that? They said they unhooked the horse. Well, obviously all the horses are unhooked at night, and they turned the cart over and slept under the cart. It's quite a rough way to live, wasn't it? And they didn't seem to complain. That's their way of life. But as I say, we have the names of all these gypsies. They came from all over the borders. This was St James's Fair, which is in September, and that was 1883. And then we move out, we're going back to Yetholm to talk about the gypsies from Yetholm. And this is the view, if you're coming over the hills from Kelso, this is the view that the one who leads the Kelso cavalcade to Yetholm each year, up to this gypsy capital. That's like when the Kelso laddie comes and he sees Kirkyetholm for the first time. And that's it there, a very small hamlet there, stuck in the border hills. And again, we're in town Yetholm. But this is not the part of the gypsies, but just to let you see the countryside around town Yetholm and the Wauchope Memorial, which is the famous thing. General Wauchope owned most of the ground around Yetholm, which he excluded all the gypsies from. And there, the main street in Yetholm, about 1910 maybe. No cars, isn't that wonderful? Today there's nothing but cars and a horse and cart coming up there. The trees have just been planted there, and these trees are massive now. And then we move up to the other end of the village, and it's a Romany house. Took the name from the gypsies, but again, town Yetholm, and nothing to do with the gypsies. It was an old doctor who lived here, and Dr. Roger, who built that. So the doctors have always been wealthy, haven't they, to build a house like that in 1900. And then down to the bottom of the village, where we turn down the hill there and make for Kirkyetholm, the Romany capital. And it's just a matter of interest. This is the place where I was born, and these houses on the right with the thatched cottage. I come from very humble beginnings, and I'm quite proud of it, because I had a wonderful mother and father, and that's them standing at the door. Onto the Hoch, we see the old ladies who are out for the afternoon to walk, maybe, across, and that's the bridge that takes you over to Kirkyetholm. Here's the ladies enjoying that, and still with things that we are not used to today, but always amuses me, or not amuses me, but interests me. They're all wearing hats. Even on the best of summer days, they've got hats on. And there we are, the Hoch, and we cross the bridge, and we come across to the mill, and this is called Yetholm Mill. It's actually in Kirkyetholm, but it's the mill at Yetholm. And these are two old gypsies there, Bob Robson and his wife Nellie. And that's the way they travelled the countryside with their horse and their cart. And then up the hill to the church. And here we have the first start of the gypsy village. This is the church that was built in 1836. And it's a wonderful church, actually. It's a wonderful building. And here we have a man who was a Blythe. He's the man that should have been the last king of the gypsies in 1898, but he wouldn't do it. But he was a fairly youngish man, and you can see what he's doing on the ladder. You could imagine, anyway, he's thatching the roof. He was a man of many talents. He could thatch the roofs, he could build, he could dig graves, he could sweep the chimneys. He was what we called the beadle at the church. And the thing about John, he had many daughters. Many of them fell by the wayside, but he brought each and every one back to his house, and he brought them up. So there was many young children they were his grandchildren, were brought up by John in this humble cottage there. It stands on the side of the road. But it was a great place to go if you were ever allowed in, because it's something about some people's houses were always a welcome. And that was the thing about Jock's house. It was always made you welcome. And sometimes in the good summer days that we remember, he would walk across the road and come into the churchyard there. Because remember, he looked after the church and he dug the graves. And he would lie down beside a headstone or against the headstone. And as he used to say, man, it's grand to be able to get up a back of a headstone. So as you can, you're still alive. Anyway, one day the two ladies walked through that gate there as we see them, and he got up and said, "Oh, good afternoon, ladies." "Oh, hello, yes, is it all right if we come into the church and the graveyard?" "Yes, he's just come in." "Do we have anything to pay?" "Not unless you're stopping." Remember, he was the gravedigger. Anyway, into the church we go, and we see the church as it was on a Festival of Flowers day, and the minister standing there. Now John, every Sunday, used to carry the Bible in, and he'd take it up to the pulpit on the left there and pass it in, and then he would walk back and bring the minister in, and then he would shut him in to that pulpit. He was always very smart. He had his tailcoat on. And when you saw him going around the village, not on a Sunday, but the other days, he was always quite tatty, but what a nice man. He was the sort of person that children took to. I used to think it was great because he used to have he would have time to stop and talk to you. And that was what when you're a child, the older generation quite often passed you by and didn't speak, but Jock never passed you by. So there was character there, and I always remember him with fondness, you might say. And these are the windows here on the church. And these are dedicated to Andrew Blythe. Andrew Blythe was a gypsy. He was a cousin of John's, and he was a gypsy. But he was quite a clever gypsy. He had part of his arm shut off when he was a young boy. But he carried on, and he was a teacher in the Cockett Valley. He taught many, many children in what they called Windy Hawk. Now, Windy Hawk, as you all know, it's at the top of the Cockett Valley, and the Northumbrian Council built a school for him there, and he taught for nearly 50 years in that valley. He taught children, and then he taught these children's children, and these children's grandchildren. So there's a real history of him in the Cockett Valley. But every weekend he walked back to Yetholm, and in the late 20s and early 30s, he became what we called the session clerk in Yetholm. And in 1829 to Yetholm came a minister called the Reverend John Baird. Now John Baird tried to convert the gypsies to be Christians and to intermarry and to live in the village. And he really did put a lot of effort into bringing the gypsies into the modern way of life. And he actually, he asked the gypsies when they went away in the spring, could they not leave the children who were maybe 10 or 11 and let them stay with local families? And he would try and integrate them into the way of life and teach them, get them to go to school so that they could enjoy life other than just a gypsy. But it's difficult to get them to change their way of life. Anyway, he tried very hard and probably was a wee bit successful. But I often think when I read that inscription on that stained glass window of Andrew Blythe, that was the culmination of his dream, to think that Andrew Blythe, a gypsy, had become session clerk, the main man in the church after the minister. That must have been would have been a great thing for him to have achieved. Andrew Blythe. My grandfather used to talk of him in very great terms, and I'm lucky in this respect that I've got generations go back that used to know the gypsies, my grandfather especially. My granny was the other way. She always saw the worst in them, but my grandfather saw the best in them. I suppose everybody's not the same. Anyway, we move on and we walk along the village, and on the left-hand side there, unfortunately, these houses are still there. We have tried very hard to get rid of them, but they've got a tin roof on them now, and somebody keeps saying, oh, they've been sold. And it'd be nice if we could just get rid of these. But this is a remembrance of the gypsy days. And we move in to the middle of the green, and we have the palace. No, that's Burnside on the left. No, that was a gypsy palace for a while. When Princess Helen was, when Charles Farr was the king, he lived in there, and that was when Princess Helen was to be the next queen, but Queen Esther beat her to it. And anyway, and when Queen Esther became queen, she was not allowed to stay in there because her sister was there and she wouldn't move out. And she moved up the hill. But on the right there is what we call Muggers Row. And that is where the gypsies stayed. That's where Captain Bennett had houses built. And they were given a very small rent to pay for them. And they carried on there for many years. Obviously that's changed, as you can see now. It's a bit more modern. It's even... many houses have changed. The cattle and everything used to go through the house door, they go through the front door into the back and everything. And then we move up the hill till we reach the little palace there. Now that palace has been there a long, long time. And that was the palace that Charles Farr Blythe II moved into when he was crowned king in 1898. He only reigned for four years. And then it was taken over by someone from Newcastle, and they painted it pink. And it was always referred to in the last 50 years as the Pink Palace, but it was never pink when there was a king in it. Many people have lived in there, but it's so small And they've altered it now and put windows in the roof there, which is a sad, sad affair. We tried very hard to get it retained just as it was, that little simple house. But now it's been altered, put the windows in the roof and a bit on the side. Which has been great, because we don't have very much in Kirkyetholm, but it'd be nice if that had just been left as it was. Charles IV II lived in there. Now we meet Queen Esther. This is certainly the first pictures I've got of the old gypsies. Queen Esther, and you can see her there in her, what would be her working clothes, I suppose, with a chutlet in her mouth. Or somebody would say, what is a chutlet? Well, a chutlet is a pipe. She's got a clay pipe in her mouth there. So she must have been fond of the pipe. She was a good queen, as I told you. She visited all the nobility in the borders, and even at her long age. And she used to have audiences with the visitors when they came, and people would make and have an audience with her. And one day the blacksmith was very, very friendly with Archie Gladstone, was very, very friendly with her. And this minister came into the blacksmith shop one day, and he was telling the blacksmith about his life and how he had lost 2 wives and what he hoped to do in the future. So that night, the blacksmith went across to Queen Esther and told her about all the history of this minister. So when the minister arrived the next morning to have an audience with the Queen, she knew all about him. And he was amazed at how she could foretell everything. And she told him what he was hoping to do in the future. He was amazed. And she turned to him, oh yes, she says, but there's only one thing, minister. She says, you're a goodly man, but what a wastery woman. His 2 wives had died, and he was ready to marry a 3rd one. So that was Queen Esther. And here we have a photograph of the last real gypsies. Now these are the youngs. These are the youngs of Yetholm. And that would say a real gypsy family, as you can see. You don't have to explain it to you, you can see it. They've got all the traits. The man, look how smart he is. He's got his watch chain there, and they're always very smart. And that was the youngs. They had lorries eventually. That man on the right there, he started up a lorry, and they had quite a big firm at the end. It was quite a big firm when we were young, because he had about 16 lorries. Not him, but his sons carried on. There's 2 children on that cart there. They started up where their father left off. The old man had 1 lorry, and they finished up with 16. And that seemed quite a lot, but not in today's terms, I suppose. When you see Eddie Stubbart, we used about 250 lorries, and even more, probably more. And Eddie Ferguson down at Blythe, he has about 200 lorries. But they had 16, and we thought that was quite a big firm at one time. But anyway, that's the gypsy family, and this is another couple of years further on, even more than a couple of years. The boys are growing up there now, getting quite big. But again, there was the things that breadwinners. There's 2 dogs there, and they're the ones that used to go poaching and getting rabbits and getting pheasants, getting hares, and that was how they lived, I suppose. But always with the children, everybody seemed to stick together. They were all very smart as they grew up. And here we have the crowning in 1898. This is the last crowning we had, because when Queen Esther died in 1883, there was nobody to follow on. But when that minister came, the minister there in the middle in 1898, he came in January 1898. Carrick Miller was his name, the Reverend Carrick Miller. He decided there should be a crowning, and they persuaded Charles IV to be the king, and they rigged them all out with his royal robes and everything, and men at the left and men at the right. The left was Mr. Herbert, Bob Herbert, and the one on the right was Archie Gladstone. There's only one gypsy there, really. That was the one with the robes on. The one with the chain round his neck was a local farmer, and the other man was Archie Gladstone. Now, Archie Gladstone, they always called Archie, was the Archbishop of the Gypsies, because he was a lover of the gypsies, and the gypsies entertained him quite a lot. He did lots for the gypsies. So that was them. Again, I think must have been a fallout there, because you have no minister there. They've phrased them out from the picture. Maybe they've taken it out, I don't know. And these are all the robes were actually hired from costumers in Edinburgh. But it turned out to be a great, great day in Yetholm, that. And there's Charles Farb, closer up picture with all his royal robes on. He didn't have them for long, mind, they were sent back as soon as it was all over. He wasn't able to keep them. And they put him onto a horse, and there he is. He put him onto a horseback, and that was him there. I mean, you've got to remember he was an old man, and he couldn't really hold the horse very well. And somebody had a laugh when they saw the next one, which was the one on the donkey, and they said, well, he was some horseman, look at that there. And somebody had a smile about the donkey. And somebody else says, you don't ever make a fool of a donkey, because the Lord rode on a donkey. And G.K. Chesterton wrote the poem about the donkeys. Fools, for I also had my hour, one fierce fast hour and sweet. There was a shout about my ears, and there was palms about my feet. And that's nice that somebody takes it like that, because the donkey was like everything else in life. They had their uses. And this was the crowning day in Yetholm. It was, you could see the amount of people on that green in Yetholm, on the roofs as well. And as we come away from the border hotel, there's the whole crowds and the king on his carriage and all the rest of it. And they come over. And this did allow them to come to Yetholm that day. And this is a better picture of the whole thing. That's the whole village looking down there. And as you look at each one, and sometimes I sit and look at this picture and you see something different every time. The houses on the right there haven't changed such a lot. But I do think it's a great picture. And something that always, it's pleasant to see the ladies so well dressed, the men as well, of course, but everybody's wearing a hat. Nowadays you hardly ever see a hat worn, it's just at weddings maybe, it's a bit there today. And I always admire these ladies. There's two ladies standing at the left-hand side there, at the front of the picture. And this is the first time a motor car came to Yetholm. It's on the left-hand side of that picture. It was by a man, Mr. Elliot, G.R.B. Elliot. He had the first motor car. That was the day they came to Yetholm. But anyway, there's so much about that picture that I can sit and admire. And on the right-hand side there is a white horse. That happened to be my grandfather. I was always quite proud to think that my grandfather was involved with it. He was a James Martin. And there was one on a black horse there. He was John Stenhouse. He led the parade. But I was quite proud that my grandfather led the procession that day. All the locals were involved. And that was it. The minister had only been there for 4 months, 5 months. And he had organised this in a very short period. And as we move on, and I have... in our year in Yetholm, we always have what they call a Barry Gadgie and a Barry Manishi. And these are the things that refer to the gypsies, because they refer to Gadgies as a man and a Manishi as a woman. And this was thing, and up on the Stovie, when the crownings were on, and some of the crownings, they went up there and they danced round these Stovie. These are quite famous. These are mentioned in history since about 1200. They danced round the stones and they drank wine. It'll be wine all right, it'd be the whiskey they were drinking. But we tried to preserve some of the traditions, and this was it. This is the Barry Gadgie and the Barry Manishi. And we have a ceremony up in the hills each year. And we probably have about 120 or 140 horses follow up the Barry Gadgie and the Manishi. All the border towns come and support us. Quickly memories fade, and if you get new people coming into the village, there's nothing to remind us that there were gypsies here. And we put this stone up, and that was what we gave them there, the stone. And the plaque that we put on, it was left to me to put it up. Here we come to one of the gypsies that I just didn't remember. I was just too small before he died. And he was John Tate. John Tate lived in the village. He was a gypsy, and he was a big man. And I suppose he'd be quite aggressive. I was talking to a man who wrote a little piece for me, and he gave it to me. This was a few years ago, and he used to say, he used to teach us to wrestle. He used to teach us how to fight. And if we didn't fight fairly, we got a clipping from him. And he was a big man, and you try to fight fairly if that's possible, to fight fairly. But John Tate, like everybody else, had to supply his family with food. And his brother-in-law, William Blythe, and John Tate, of course, his nickname was Stovie Jock. They crossed the border into England and they went poaching for rabbits, because there was plenty in these days, plenty of rabbits, and they would poach a few. And I would like to think that they did it ill. Somebody says, did they do it legally? Of course they didn't do it legally, because people used to buy the rabbits on the farms in these days, and the rabbit catcher would set their snares and they would catch rabbits. But John and they would go and dig them out. They wouldn't pinch any rabbits from the snares. Even rogues have a code of conduct, and they would never pinch anybody else's rabbits from a snare. That was not the thing done. Even if you were a rogue, you wouldn't do that. That's one thing. But they would go and dig them out. They would have a ferret and put the ferret in, and the rabbits would come out, and that's how they would get them. But this shepherd one day, he saw them on the hill there, on the side of the hill, and he told them, he says, you shouldn't be here because these rabbits belong to the rabbit catcher. But they ignored them and they just carried on. The shepherd went away and got the policeman. And when they came down the hill with the rabbits, the few rabbits they had, probably had about 20 or something like that, and they came just to this gate, just beside, and it was just beside the border. And they were accosted there, and the policeman said, we'll have to give these rabbits over. But they threw them over the wall. And that's what they call the policeman's gate there. And it was there that the policeman tried to get a hold of Tate and said, look, I'm going to have to arrest you or something like that. Words were exchanged and they started fighting. Tate shouted, quick, get a climby, and fell him with a climby. So he took a stone off the wall and hit the policeman on the head, William Blythe. Anyway, Constable Scott, he died about 3 days later. So they were arrested after his death and they were taken down into, I'm not sure where it was, but they served their time. Tate was given 20 years for killing the policeman, and Blythe, as an accessory, was given 10 years. Of course, Blythe, as I say, was his brother-in-law, and he got off lighter. He never came back to Yetholm. William Blythe went away down just north of Alnwick. It's one of the villages. He had a woman there, and he had a son, and he took the son away to America, and they never came back to Yetholm. Well, John in 1900 came back to Yetholm. Am I talking right here? And he came off the train at Mindrum, and on that day it just happened that my grandfather was there. And he said to him, John, he says, are you wanting a lift back to Yetholm? Aye, Jim, he says, I'll take a lift back with you. And as they're coming up, he had 2 horses and carts, and he was telling about his life in the prison. 20 years, a long time for anybody to spend. He kind of condoned a murder, but he didn't go out to murder the policeman. They were just going to have a fight. That was how it started out. And as you're coming along the road, they came to what we call the high road from Mindrum. And you look across towards Yetholm. And it was there that my grandfather said, Jock, would you like me to take you across to Yetholm? No, Jim, he says, I dinna. You see that view across there? He says, that's what I have thought about for 20 years. And now that I'm just going to walk across the Hawk there and up into Yetholm, because he had a very small house there. Well, John came back into Yetholm and he lived there for, 20 years I think it was. And he became quite a character. Obviously somebody who had murdered a policeman was a character. But he became a gentle character, a gentle giant, you might have said. He wouldn't let anybody mess about with him. And he got his donkeys, and he had his dog. He had Mark, he had a lurcher, and he had Jeannie, one of his ponies. And he used to travel the countryside once he got himself settled in and sell little bits of wares. And they used to talk about in friendly terms. I talked to his great-granddaughter the other day, and she was talking about our great-grandfather. I like to hear stories about him. So I was telling her about them. And she was saying, oh, that's rather nice to hear, the fact that he came back. His wife had gone away to Kelso and lived with one of her daughters in Kelso, and she never had anything to do with him again. And she died actually in Kelso. And this great-granddaughter's mother lives in Hoyt now. But John used to tell the stories about little stories. He would tell people stories about. They said he was like a talking newspaper because he would arrive at a farm and he would bring the news from one farm to the next. So he became quite a character. And how he got Stovie Jock, I think he maybe got it after because he was so fond of Stovie tatties. He would ask them for bits of meat and he would ask them, and he would make it himself. He'd make up his stovies, but that's the way. And again, the local, we had absent landlords on the farms then as well as now. And this landlord, he was an admiral of the fleet actually, Admiral Oliver. He says, "Here, Tate, I hear your donkeys eat thistles." "Aye, the div," he says, "the div." He says, "I wonder if you'd bring some of your donkeys out. I've got a field I can't do very much with. There's so many thistles." "I'll do that, Admiral. I'll bring them out." So he took his 2 or 3 donkeys out and put them into the field, and the Admiral saw them about 3 weeks later. He says, "Here, Tate, I haven't seen one difference in that field. There's still so many thistles." "Aye, Admiral, aye, just give them time. They'll eat all the grass first." So, I mean, you have to take the wit. They were never short of that. They weren't going to be fooled by anything that anybody would. But the Admiral, I suppose, he changed his mind about him. And one day, you know how years ago, the farms, they had loads of workers. And one night, Stovie was coming back on his little pony, and he came to this steep hill. And in the field, just beside the steep hill, the men were working in the fields. And there was one brash steward, the man, the head man of the workers, was in there. He says, "Oh, here's Stovie Jock coming. Come on," he says, "we'll have some fun with him." But again, you've got to be careful because of their wit. He rushed across. "Come on," he says, we'll see what we can do." "Aye, Jock," he says, "you'll have to get rid of that old donkey." He says, "Just no, it can't pull you up the hill." "No, son, I can. But he can," he says, "I can't get another yet." "Oh," he says, "how's that?" He says, "Oh, the farmers are taking them for stewards." So again, you know, the wit was always there. And there's so many things we hear about Jock. But the sad thing was, when he took ill at the very end of his life, he lived in this little house, and somebody said they hadn't seen him that morning, and the minister and the doctor went across to see if they could get in to see how he was, and they could look through the window and they could see he was lying in bed. So they tried to go in, but the dog wouldn't let them in, Mark wouldn't let them in, they couldn't get near him. So they had to go and get a gun and shoot the dog before they got in to get old Jock. And they carried him out, took him to the hospital. But within a couple of days he had died. And that's a sad story, isn't it, to think that there at the end he was on his own. I know that he did murder somebody. I know that he was responsible, but you can't help feeling sad for it. And talking one day to the school children about it, one little boy came up crying. He says, "Mr. Tokely, I felt sad when you told us about the dog being shot." I says, "Well, so would everybody else." So these are the little stories about Kirkieton. And this again was Kirkieton, probably the years that John Tate was there. And we had a local poet, and he wrote a piece of poetry. "At a bend in the border twixt Cocket and Cale, there lies a wee hamlet in a tree-covered vale. And this is Kirkieton, as the map set it down. But to me it has aye been a Romany tune. The wild whop above the music outpours, the grey heron fishes a feud from its doors. The bowman flows past, and the chievites look down with a smile on the houses of Romany town." And these are the hills that the gypsies used to travel with their wares and with their smuggling days. And again, and into the hills there, the chievites on that day, they did look well. And you could imagine them into the valleys and the crevices there. They could hide away there. And this is in the Halterburn Valley. And we go across to the Chieviates. And this is Cheviot and this is Henhall. You could just imagine them hiding cattle or stock somewhere in there. And these were part of the weaving days, and the gypsies were all part of it. Again, that's in the College Valley. And we're back into Kirkieton. And whenever I see these roofs of old thatch, my wish is to linger, and lifting the latch, is to enter and hear from these lean folks in brown The Wonders and Witches of Romany Town. And that was the poetry that was written by Will Ogilvie, and that's back to Kirkheaton on a bright summer's day. And that's my little story of the gypsies of Kirkheaton.